Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Heidi, and today on the show, we are talking about some romance movies. Yes, we have talked about romance movies before, so I guess you could say this is Romance Part 2. I guess you could say Romance Part 2, after the honeymoon phase. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But the weather is, well, it's still kind of cold, but I would imagine that it will soon be getting warmer. It is post-Valentine's Day. I like to think that the birds will start chirping more and more flowers will start coming out. You know, I mean, I'm in California, so some of these things have already started. But for the rest of you who are probably freezing out somewhere else, I will say it is coming. The sun will be coming out again soon. Hopefully the ice will start thawing. And really, as it turns into spring, I feel a sense for romance movies. I feel like I need to watch more of them. It's really the winter and the spring that makes me feel the need to watch romance movies. The winter because you need something just to kind of like curl up into and it just make you feel warm on the inside. But spring also because it's just, I think it's my favorite season. If you were to remove allergies, I think it is the most romantic season of all of them. Allergies are not super romantic. They are mostly gross and snotty, but beyond allergies, I think the spring is a very romantic time, and it is, all of this is just corresponding with the release of the film Isn't It Romantic, which stars Rebel Wilson, and I just think it's a perfect time for that. She she takes a very funny spin on the romance film genre, and also in the film she references the classic Pretty Woman with the wonderful and illuminous Julia Roberts. I can't see her without, she just glows. I don't know if it's like the 80s lighting of that film. I'm not sure. But on this episode, we are talking about Isn't It Romantic and the classic Pretty Woman. Again, I know Pretty Woman's not, it's hard to talk about a classic, and it's not like a film that no one has ever talked about before, but Rebel Wilson's film does hint and pretty obviously have references to Pretty Woman, so I think that it's time to talk about it, and especially appropriate with Isn't It Romantic. So first I want to talk about Isn't It Romantic. This just recently came out, so 2019, directed by Todd Strauss Skousen. It is written by Aaron Cardillo, Dana Fox, and Katie Silberman. The film stars Rebel Wilson as Natalie, who is an Australian architect living in New York, Liam Hemsworth as Blake, who is a client of the architect firm and also a love interest for Natalie, Adam Devine as Josh, who is Natalie's friend and also another love interest, Priyanka Chopra as Isabella, who is a yoga ambassador, aka a model, Betty Gilpin as Whitney, who is Natalie's assistant and one of her best friends, and Brandon Scott Jones as Donnie, who is Natalie's neighbor and friend. The cast, I just want to say, is a very strong cast. Do I really think this is anyone's performance of a lifetime? No, but just looking at who's in this film, there are many recognizable names. I did not even recognize Betty Gilpin, but she is in Glow, and they have changed her wardrobe. They do a big wardrobe change in the movie for her. I did not recognize her in either wardrobe. She was very good. Rebel Wilson is really just a force of nature. So, of course, I had to see her new project. So this film is about Natalie. And she's living in New York, and she has always believed that what she saw in rom-coms was all fantasy. Her bubble was burst by her mother when she was a child, that rom-coms were not real. But she thwarts a potential mugger at a subway station and is knocked out while trying to flee the scene. When she wakes up, however, she discovers that she is in a PG-13 rom-com universe, and to escape, she has to deal with all of the cliches that are everywhere around her, and she has to fall in love to achieve the happily ever after that she hopes will bring her back to reality. This is like sort of the anti-rom-com because it's weird how she's trying to pull this like making fun of romantic comedies for all of us to laugh at. But at the same time, this is a romantic comedy. She kind of has a moment where she's like, maybe rom-coms aren't that bad. Not really. She doesn't say it quite like that, but you kind of realize her life is like a romantic comedy in some ways. And I think she has to open herself up a little bit to that. But it has some laughs. It's fun. It's just this take on the rom-com cliches. So many of the cliches are very obviously poked fun at. And it plays some of those cliches out sometimes. There are some corny musical numbers, much to the dismay of Natalie. And I would say some of these cliches are funnier than others. I probably am a bit of a cynic, so I did not laugh out loud at all of them. There were some scenes that I laughed at. I appreciated how they kind of made fun of the idea like, oh, the protagonist female always has a gay best friend. And I kind of thought that was like funny. Like, it's not an observation that any of us didn't see, but that's what they're doing. They're trying to say we all are aware of these cliches, and they make fun of it. And I think it is funny in general. The film, it tries to go a little bit to a deeper place, more about self-love, and about, I guess, taking care of yourself more than the belief that you need to find a man, kind of like your own personal love story. You don't have to find someone else to prove your self-worth, really. I feel like they smashed that into the end. The end of the film is very sped up. I definitely got the feeling that they overshot things for this film, and then so much just got lost in the cutting room. Some of that is more obvious than others, but the ending and all of it feels very rushed. Much of it is just jam-packed. And I don't know. I think also because I just watched this recently, there is a wedding scene which just made me think of Priyanka's recent extremely glamorous wedding. I did find it funny that Priyanka's character said she was a yoga ambassador when she's definitely a model. Her character's definitely a very gorgeous model in this film. I thought that was kind of funny. Also with the casting, again, Rebel Wilson's great, but Adam Devine, who you might know from Workaholics and from Pitch Perfect, I feel like probably him and Rebel Wilson filmed so many jokes, so much material, and then they probably had to be like, all right, Adam, that was really funny. Now make it PG-13. In other words, don't make any jokes. He sort of got to be the leading man in this film. He does still play kind of a goofball, and he still plays the best friend character, but it was interesting. I bought him, as a leading man, but when you have him and Liam Hemsworth, I mean, they obviously put them together in this film for comedic purposes, but again, I just think Adam Devine is funny. I just feel like he probably, again, I can't imagine that all of the jokes he made it into the film. I mean, they definitely didn't. This film would have been very different if they had just let him run wild. He had to be very conservative in all of his jokes. So it was interesting to see him play that role. I sort of enjoyed it. Okay, I do want to talk about some of the controversy that has been surrounding this film, just a little bit. So, firstly, this film plays with some things that I think is kind of playing with fire. It's funny how they point out the protagonist of a romantic comedy always has like a gay best friend who just has too much free time. I think they make fun of the negative trope of that. like, you know, they say that person's usually over the top, and they want to make fun of it, to point out how silly that is, to assume that all people who are gay are like that. It doesn't do anything to, I don't know, combat that very much. It just mostly does it for jokes, not really for any other alternate purpose besides that, in my opinion. I feel like people can say that it's trying to go for something else, you know, trying to have a deeper, more social justice type of opinion. And maybe it's trying. I wouldn't really say it's succeeding. They also talk about the idea and like try and make fun of the idea that a plus size woman doesn't really get to star in a romantic film. And they try to make fun of how ridiculous of an idea that is. Rebel Wilson has publicly expressed that the film is an empowering film for plus size women. I will say that although it is partially empowering just to have a leading lady who is plus size, I don't think that's enough, because they do a lot of jokes at her expense for her size. For example, there's a scene with a food vendor who asks her to stop his runaway food cart with her body, and he even comments that she's built like a cement truck, which I think is funny, but if your view is to empower women who are plus size, I really feel like this film doesn't really do that. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe just having Rebel Wilson be the protagonist is enough, potentially. Just like pointing like, oh, it's so funny that people think that, you know, people who are gay are all like this. Like, maybe that is enough to just say, just to point out how ridiculous that notion is and how ridiculous that stereotype is. But I don't know. They could have done more. Actually, maybe they couldn't have. I don't think it was ever in the script to have it be more progressive than that. But it's interesting that Rebel Wilson really took up that and said that it is super empowering for plus-size women. I believe she also made a faux pas and said that she was the first plus-size woman to ever star in a romantic comedy. I don't know. It's been interesting. I think it's an interesting debate whether this film actually does that, or I personally don't think that was ever really its intention. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we will keep talking about the film Isn't It Romantic?
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. We are continuing to talk about the romance films, Isn't It Romantic and Pretty Woman. I want to keep talking about Isn't It Romantic, which stars Rebel Wilson. I talked a little bit about some of the controversy before the break, and I guess I want to continue about that and say I don't feel like, even if Rebel Wilson wants this film to be empowering for plus-size women, I don't think it is super empowering in that sense. I mean, I don't think it's nearly as empowering as like how Wonder Woman was really empowering for women. I think this film is, I don't think that means this film doesn't have some good laughs. I think it does. But overall, I wouldn't say it is a film meant strictly for empowerment. I think it's really just meant for laughs. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure other people can disagree with me, or I'm sure other people do disagree with me. Of course they can. But if you have other thoughts, I would like to know. Some other observations about this film. So I kind of feel like this film comes a little too late for its time. A lot of the cliches that we know from rom-coms were like movies that were made in like the 80s or 90s or early 2000s. Again, kind of like Pretty Woman. Or also they have like Whitney who is Natalie's assistant, is in the office watching romantic comedies, and she's watching like The Wedding Singer at some point. And like these movies are not current films. They're ones that have been made in the past. And I feel like because of that, this film, Isn't It Romantic? It probably would have been a bigger hit had it been released back then too. I think it would have been funnier and it would have been more relevant if it came out back then. Like right now in our current culture, when I think of current romantic comedies, I think of films like To All the Boys That I've Ever Loved, streaming on Netflix, which I feel like does not have the same cliches that they are making fun of in this film. It does have some very cute moments that are sort of adorable, but could potentially be eye-rolly depending on how you feel about romantic comedies and romantic movies in general. But I just feel like it's just sort of behind its time. And I don't know if that's, maybe this was like a film that was, someone was dreaming about writing a while ago and they just got the ability to do it now. I'm not really sure why that is, that I feel like it's not coming out in the right times. I think it still is funny, but it would have been funnier if it was more relevant. And in the direction that I see romantic movies going in now, I feel like a lot of those cliches will be shed. And this film might kind of be like the end of the cliches in romantic comedies that we currently know. So I don't know. I would be curious to see how that changes. Some of the cliches I mentioned, like the gay best friend, or how if there are two women in a workplace, they have to be mortal enemies and just hate each other, or like musical numbers that just come out of nowhere. Also, the leading man who is super gorgeous and always like tries to sound philosophical, like Liam Hemsworth's character quotes Gandhi all the time, and like like the Buddha, and tries to sound super deep, just like, I don't know, Kisses Under the Rain, things like that. I will be curious to see if those cliches are shed later on. Again, I do think this film could kind of just be like the end of it all, just mark the death of those type of cliches as we move forward. So I would be interested to see that. Also, I mentioned this before. I feel like the film is just smashed together at the end. Like they try and fit so much. And the problem with that is they really try and put a lot of the heavier emotional parts at the end when they're just trying to wrap it up. And there is a particular scene that I want to talk about involving this. There is a setup for a joke in this film that involves like a classic makeover montage scene with Rebel Wilson as Natalie and her friend Donnie, who's played by Brandon Scott Jones. And they set up for this joke, like they're going to have a super eye-rolly wardrobe clothes changing montage. But then it doesn't go anywhere. It just cuts. Like they don't do it at all. It's very abrupt. And I would say it's jarring, and really obviously the joke was just lost to the cutting floor, as they used to say. Although now the joke is lost. The whole scene is just lost in some folder within a folder within a folder in like an editor's computer somewhere. But I feel like that to me is the most obvious scene. But there's also things like I mentioned the cliche where if there's two women in a workplace, they have to be mortal enemies. Natalie and her best friend Whitney, once Natalie goes into this alternate like romantic universe, her and Whitney become mortal enemies. And I feel like they never went into that character in that part of the movie. They never gave her like any sort of real scene with Rebel Wilson, and they could have, and I think it could have been really interesting, but they just didn't do it. And again, I think that could have been something where they filmed it and then they just decided, nope, don't have time, and cut it out. They also put in some musical numbers. The main one that I'm thinking of is like they're at a karaoke bar, and not that it's not funny. I mean, it was almost so spot on to like a cringy romantic comedy or just romantic musical that I almost just couldn't take it. It was almost so cringy and so spot on in its cringe that it was too much. Which again is probably just me because I'm not a huge fan of musicals. But that stretched on for a long time. I don't think it necessarily had to be as long as it was. But I think they just made some editorial choices which I probably would have raised complaint about had I been consulted, which sadly I was not. But who knows? Maybe if I had, it could have been Oscar nominated. I'm not sure. But they really cut a lot out, and I don't think they chose all of the right choices. Also, I am very surprised the wardrobe scene was allowed to come into the final picture. I think it's very poorly done. Really obviously they completely just randomly cut it, in my opinion. Also, I want to say this film it's very Hollywood cute. You know, like it's like the sunshine, and a funny part is that Rebel Wilson jokes that New York smells really good suddenly in her like rom-com alternate universe. And I think that's funny, and they put in a lot of cute Hollywood moments, but it doesn't have sort of like the grounding, like realness about romance and relationships that honestly some romantic films do. That's not the type of film that this movie is trying to satire. But again, I just think in the coming few years with romantic films, that's where they're going to be. They're going to be more grounded and more real. And I just kept so many things kept happening in this film, like especially between the romance that you're like, okay, this is the romance that's going to last. Like you kind of see it coming from the very beginning of the film, you know it's going to happen. But there are things where I'm like, well, that's not realistic to a relationship. And potentially I'm just barking up the wrong tree. Like that's not what this movie is about. But I think, again, that just relates to, I feel this movie is made too late. It lacks the realism that other films that are more popular have. And I don't think this movie had a ton of competition in the box office when it opened. Maybe just Alita, which did not have very good reviews. This film, from what I found, was better reviewed than Alita, the sci-fi film that's out right now. But I don't think there's enough competition for me to it didn't do very well in sales and in box office when it opened, and I don't think that's because it had competition. I just think it wasn't spectacular. I did see a lot of hype for it. I've seen trailers for it for a while in theaters, but I think it's good for a solid laugh. I think if you want to take a date and just kind of treat it light, don't go not for anything serious. It's not a movie that'll make you, cry or anything. If you just want to go, maybe like have a girls' night, I think it would be funny. I think it would be enjoyable. I don't think it's super deep, and not that I think that's what it's going for, but I think because of that, it won't last, and I don't think it'll be super memorable for a lot of people who are going to watch it. Also, I want to say, I got the song Pretty Woman stuck in my head after this movie, just because they keep mentioning Pretty Woman, and I honestly can't remember if they record it or if they play it in this film, but it was so stuck in my head that I had to listen to it after I got out of the theater and as I was driving home. It was, I don't know, it was interesting. But again, for a light, enjoyable laugh, I would suggest that you watch it. Liam Hemsworth is in it. He is shirtless. So if you're into that, go for it. If you just want to peek on Miley Cyrus's new husband, go ahead. He's in the film, and he's pretty good. I think it's pretty funny. So with that, we're going to take another break, and then we'll be right back and talk about the classic Pretty Woman.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. We are continuing to talk about some romantic films. I want to move on now to the film Pretty Woman, which is really a classic. I mean, if you like romantic films at all, or even if you just have found yourself channel surfing sometime in the evening, you have probably come across this movie and watched it. I don't use the word classic lightly, but I really do enjoy this film. And I enjoyed how they sort of brought it into Isn't It Romantic? And I thought it was funny how they did it. Subtle, but still enough for me to recognize it. Still, I will say you can poke as much fun as you want about this film. I'm going to enjoy it no matter what. I'm not going to be cynical about it. It is from 1990, and yeah, the fashion is very obviously from 1990. It is directed by Gary Marshall, and it is written by J.F. Lawton. It is starring Richard Gere as Edward Lewis, Julia Roberts as Vivian Ward, also Jason Alexander as Philip Stuckey. This is such a classic. This is about Vivian, who is a prostitute on Hollywood Boulevard, and she gets picked up by Richard Gere, he's not really there looking for a prostitute that evening, but that's what ends up happening because he's looking for directions, and she offers to give him directions. And this film, it develops into a romance, not just a one-night stand, and Vivian ends up spending a whole week with with Edward as he is in town. And it is cute. It is, and I don't want to say that about a film that glamorizes prostitution, but it really is adorable. I want to mention, something that I did not know about when I was researching this film, but interesting tidbit. This was written by J.F. Lawton, and it was meant to originally be a darker film called 3000. Not 300, there's no Spartans, but called 3000. And up until Disney purchased it, it remained, darker. It was a screenplay, and it was later developed into what we know now. Mostly the ending of it was changed. So the original script had many of the scenes and many of the characters, again, which are the same. But what changed was the ending mostly. And the tone of the ending was very different. And Vivian and Edward didn't end up together. And I guess what happened in the end of the original screenplay is Kit and Vivian are on a bus to go to Disneyland. And Kit, if you have not seen the film, is Vivian's friend in the film. She is also a prostitute, and they are roommates as well. And so they're on a bus on the way to Disneyland, and which is also a bit odd because the film was bought by Disney, but whatever. And on the bus, Kit is anticipating a really fun day at Disneyland, which is actually financed by Vivian's week with Edward. But in the end, Vivian is seen staring out the window, just looking empty as she looks out onto the road. Apparently, that's how it's supposed to end, which is so much darker and sadder and depressing than how this film ends. Not that I think the movie would have been bad, but I definitely feel it would not have become the beloved classic that it is now. And again, Disney has to have a happy ending. It's also really funny that, of course, it has to have a princess ending, that Disney wanted that changed, and they are Disney. They always have to have a princess. So I think it would have been still a good film, and it definitely would have fallen for me into this, 80s, early 90s, just this category of more serious, darker films. I don't know. I guess it seems dated in its fashion, and I think because of that, it would have not been as much of a classic without the happy ending to sort of carry it through to what we enjoy now. I don't know. As I said, I don't like that it glamorizes prostitution, but I still enjoy this film probably because it has a happy ending. Also, because Julia Roberts is just so gosh darn charming. I can't watch this film and not think that. It's incredible. She just glows. Also, her outfits, she has so many different outfits. I love watching it. And again, if they had kept it to its same dark ending, even the outfits wouldn't have made me love something that ends tragically, or at least maybe not tragically, but ends on a sadder note. Also about the acting, you have Richard Gere, who plays Edward, or Eddie, as Vivian says she wants to call him. He's a very nice man, but you can also tell he's a businessman. Or sort of a business killer. He buys businesses and then sort of pieces them apart and sells those pieces. It's interesting. I don't know. I really like Richard Gere in this film. I could not stop thinking about the age difference between them, though. Don't let that put you down, but yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about that. Also, I want to mention this film is kind of like a reverse of a traditional romantic film, where in a traditional film, the romantic, the girl, she just wants the guy, you know, she needs him to complete her life. And I felt like in this film, Vivian didn't really need a man. Like, it could have ended on that darker note where she didn't need him. It felt more like Edward needed Vivian, and she brought more of the light to his life. He was a bit more of a stick in the mud, and she lightened everything up, and that's what he needed, sort of to have more fun in his life, which to me seems like a bit of a reverse of the traditional, where the girl, you know, it's kind of stuck up baby, and she needs a guy to, like, you know, make her laugh and have that type of romance and fling that she needs to loosen up. So that was interesting. Also, something that isn't it romantic made fun of that I thought was pretty funny is the cutaway sex scenes. You don't see much in this film. You see, I guess you could say, suggestive situations where you know what's going to happen, and you know that they're not really wearing clothes, but that doesn't happen. They cut away from it, and that's what is made fun of in Isn't It Romantic? After seeing Isn't It Romantic, I couldn't stop thinking about that in this film. Be like, oh, of course they're going to cut it. We're not going to see anything. So I thought that was funny. And in the end, it just shows that everyone wants to be cared for. I mean, Vivian, she's not necessarily just because she wants the money, although that is where it starts, but also she meets a man who is kind and nice and is sort of growing in his kindness, at least in relation to his business persona and what he does for work. But also Edward, he really wants someone to spend time with and just to share life with. And so you kind of see the desire for everyone just to be cared for. Also, this is just a random personal note. This film kept reminding me of The Princess Diaries. I don't know why. I think it's some way that Vivian behaved. It kind of reminded me of Anne Hathaway's character in that film. And for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of this actor, but he plays a man who works at the hotel. He's like the hotel manager in this film in Pretty Woman, and he also is in Princess Diaries, and he plays such a similar character. I could not see it. I pointed it out to my boyfriend, and we kept thinking about that the entire time while watching it. So, I don't know. Now maybe I've ruined it, where you're just going to see the Princess Diaries in this film, but that was what I really... In the end, I feel like you need to see this film, and yes, it does remind me of The Princess Diaries, but it is a classic all on its own. Please go see it. It is adorable. Also, I would say if you want in for a light laugh, you should also go see Isn't It Romantic while it's in theaters. So that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening, and please tune in to the next GSMC movie podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.